Hey, worship team leader, real quick, we're going to get right into the devotional. But before we do, I want to let you know that I put together discussion questions for this devotional. So check it out down in the description below. You can find them there. They're free, and you should download those, print them out before you watch this video with your team so that you have something to discuss afterwards. Other than that, here's the devotional. Hey, worship team, welcome to week number 4, the final week of this devotional that we've been working through called Defining Worship. And this is the payoff. At the end, we finally get to put together our biblical definition of worship. And how are we going to do that? Well, let's think back to the last 3 weeks. What have we done? We've spent the last 3 weeks looking at 3 of the most common words in the New Testament that are translated as worship. And just a recap of those, because these are going to form the basis of our ultimate definition. The first word that we looked at was the word sabo. And the word sabo meant to fear or to revere God. And remember what we learned through our study of that word. We learned, as Jesus said in Matthew 15, that there is a way to worship God. There's a way to sabo God, to fear God, that is in vain. It is empty and it is worthless. And why would it be empty or worthless? It's because we would teach as doctrines the commandments of men. It's when our worship isn't rightly founded that it throws everything off and our worship ends up being in vain. So that's what we learned from the word sabo. Our second word that we looked at was the word proskuneo, and that is the most commonly translated word as worship in the New Testament. And that word literally means to bow down. Think of you with your face on the floor, your hands down, you're laying prostrate before God. And the principle that we learned from that word is that it's not just about the outward act of bowing down. You could bow down and not be worshiping God. But ultimately, what we learned is that it has to do with the posture of your heart. So it happens in us. It happens in our hearts first. And that's what we learned from proskuneo. It's not simply about the outward acts, which we're going to talk about here in 1 second, but it is ultimately about hearts that treasure God above all other things. And then our final word that we looked at last week was the word latruo. And the word latruo means to serve. We thought of the picture of the priests serving in the temple. And what we learned is that we no longer serve in the temple anymore, in the earthly temple at least, but we are still in service to God. Romans 12:1, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual latreia before God. So worship is not just what we feel in our hearts, but it will naturally overflow into external acts of glorification. So there are our 3 words for worship. Let's take those, piece them together to get a biblical understanding of what worship is. And here is a biblical definition of worship that I propose to you. Worship is a rightly founded treasuring of God in our hearts above all other things that overflows into external acts of glorification. Do you see how we've wrapped up those 3 words into one definition, and they all feed into each other? I'll say it again. Worship is a rightly founded, sabo, treasuring of God in our hearts above all other things, proskuneo, that overflows into external acts of glorification, latruo. If you miss out on any of those pieces, you are left with an incomplete picture of worship. If our worship isn't rightly founded, then it'll be in vain, like Jesus said in Matthew 15. If our worship doesn't flow from our hearts, proskuneo, then what's going to happen? We're just going to be going through the motions of what we think worship should look like. And it's going to be stale, dead, cold religious activity. And if we know God rightly and we treasure him in our hearts, but we don't allow that to overflow into external acts of glorification and shape the way that we live our lives in worship to God, offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, then our worship is dead. Just like your faith is dead without works, as James says, your worship is dead without latruo. We must allow the rightly founded knowledge of God to lead us to treasuring him in our hearts, and we must allow that to overflow into external acts of glorification. Now, at the beginning of the study, I said I don't just want this to be a biblical definition and leave you with there's your knowledge, right? I want this to be a practical definition. So let's talk about some practical implications. I'm going to throw out a few, and then you'll discuss a few more in your discussion time. The first is this: if we want our worship, and not just our worship, but we're worship leaders, right? So we're leading our church in worship. If we want our worship to be think of the word sabo, if we want it to be rightly founded, how do we do that? Well, it involves taking people to the Word of God where God has revealed himself. If you want your church's worship to be rightly founded and not in vain, you better have a whole lot of this whenever you're leading your people in worship. You should be reading the Word. You should be preaching the Word. You should be singing the Word. You should be seeing the Word in your communion and your baptism. Let your services be saturated with the Word, because that will make sure that your service to God, your worship, your saboing of him, will be rightly founded. And then not only that, but our worship must come from our heart. It must be an adoring of God, a treasuring of God in our hearts. What does that mean for when we lead our church? Well, that means that we should be helping people not just see the truth in the Word, but to savor the truth in the Word. So worship leader, if you speak between songs, think about that. I need to take them to the Bible, but not just to impart knowledge to them, but to help them savor the truth of God, whether that is God as creator, God as just, God as holy, the work that Christ has done. Whatever you take people to, don't just let it be head knowledge, but let it infiltrate their heart. And then finally, implications for the word latruo. All of this must overflow into external acts of glorification. So for you, as a worship team member, think of how you're going to prepare this week. You might be at worship rehearsal right now. How are you going to prepare? Are you just going to go through the motions and let your worship right now, like worship isn't just singing, it's also how you're about to serve your church right now through preparing to lead them on Sunday. Are you going to allow that to just be routine? Or will this act of you preparing right now come from a rightly founded knowledge of God, come from a treasuring of that knowledge of God, God himself, in your hearts, and now will you let that overflow into how you prepare to lead your church well on Sunday? Thanks so much for spending the past 4 weeks with me. I'll send you into your discussion time now. Until I see it in the next devotional or the next time somewhere, keep leading worship well.